Everyone in the office judged him as distant, unfriendly, someone who didn't belong. She believed it too, until one ordinary day, his bag fell open, and a small lunchbox revealed the truth he'd carried in silence. Inside wasn't arrogance or pride, it was love, loss, and a reminder of how little we really know about people. The rain had just stopped when Evelyn Carter stepped into the glass building that housed Lumen Advertising, one of Chicago's fast-growing creative agencies. The air smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet, the kind of scent that carried both ambition and fatigue. She was 26, freshly promoted from a small-town firm, and determined to leave her mark. The open office buzzed with energy, keyboards clicking, muted laughter from clustered desks, and the steady hum of an espresso machine that never seemed to rest. Evelyn noticed quickly how the place was divided, not by walls, but by invisible lines. The extroverts filled the center, talking over one another, tossing ideas like confetti. The quieter ones, those who didn't match the unspoken office rhythm, sat near the edges. That was where she first saw Marcus Reed. He sat by the window, head bent slightly forward, his hand steady on the tablet as he sketched something that looked more like art than marketing. No one spoke to him. He didn't seem to mind. On her first morning, she passed by his desk with a friendly smile, half expecting a return gesture. He only nodded once without looking up. She told herself it was fine, that some people were just introverted. Still, something about his silence unsettled her. She grew up believing kindness deserved acknowledgement, that courtesy was a small thread holding workplaces together. But as hours turned into days, she began to sense that Marcus's quietness wasn't ordinary reserve. It felt deliberate. The team operated like a well-rehearsed play. The creative leads, mostly white and middle class, praised one another's ideas with rehearsed enthusiasm. Marcus's contributions, when shared in meetings, often drifted past unnoticed until someone else rephrased them. Evelyn caught that pattern once and dismissed it as coincidence. When it happened again, she felt the discomfort bloom deeper, though she still said nothing. Her supervisor, Kara, was the type of woman who smiled without warmth. During Evelyn's second week, Kara mentioned Marcus casually, as if delivering a warning wrapped in gossip. Marcus is talented, but a little hard to work with. Keeps to himself too much. Doesn't really blend. The tone was friendly, but Evelyn caught the undercurrent. Blend with what, exactly? She wanted to ask, but she didn't. She wasn't sure she was ready to question things in a new workplace where belonging still felt fragile. Each morning, Marcus arrived early, carrying the same worn black backpack. He placed it carefully beneath his desk, as though it contained something fragile. During lunch breaks, he disappeared into the break room while others gathered in clusters, scrolling through their phones or chatting about weekend plans. Evelyn started bringing her lunch to her desk too. Partly out of convenience, partly out of curiosity, she would glance at Marcus from time to time, noticing the small details, the way he always kept his phone face down, how he sometimes smiled faintly at his own sketches before closing his tablet. But kindness, when unreciprocated, often hardens into judgment. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn's attempts at friendliness grew less frequent. His silence began to irritate her. She told herself that maybe he looked down on her, or worse, that he simply didn't care. The more she thought about it, the more it stung. She started matching his quiet with her own, avoiding his corner of the office altogether. Still, something about him gnawed at her attention. One afternoon, as she was organizing files near the design station, she overheard a few coworkers laughing softly. "Marcus still eats alone," one said. "Maybe he likes pretending he's better than everyone." The others chuckled. Evelyn forced a smile, not joining, but not objecting either. Later, she replayed that moment in her mind, uneasy with her silence. The months began to blur. Evelyn's confidence grew professionally, but thinned personally. The office had accepted her, but she couldn't shake the sense that it had cost her something. The empathy she once wore so easily now felt like a luxury. She focused on results, deadlines, and the quiet competition that defined creative life. Marcus became an afterthought, until that one gray Thursday afternoon. She had stayed late, finishing a pitch deck, when she noticed Marcus across the room packing up his things. The lights flickered softly above, the office nearly empty. He knelt beside his chair, retrieving something from his bag. A small photograph slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Evelyn saw it before he did. A child's face, smiling wide, framed by sunlight. Marcus froze, then swiftly tucked it back into the bag, as if it were something sacred. Their eyes met for a brief, tense second. His expression wasn't irritation or embarrassment. It was something else, private, almost wounded. That moment lingered long after he left. For the first time, Evelyn wondered if his silence had nothing to do with arrogance at all. The days that followed that quiet Thursday unfolded with a strange weight Evelyn couldn't name. She often found herself glancing toward Marcus's desk, wondering about the photograph she had seen. Yet whenever she considered asking about it, her pride interfered. In her mind, he had chosen distance. She convinced herself that his silence was personal, that he had decided she wasn't worth acknowledgement. That thought stung more than she cared to admit. Work moved forward in its usual rhythm, tight deadlines, competitive meetings, and the subtle hierarchy that defined the agency's culture. Marcus continued to deliver strong designs, but his work rarely received credit in full. When ideas were discussed around the meeting table, his voice came quiet, deliberate, always focused on the concept rather than the ego. But his suggestions often slipped into the background until someone else echoed them, louder, more confidently. Evelyn noticed this one afternoon and caught herself thinking how unfair it seemed, though she said nothing. The same quiet hesitation that had kept Marcus from speaking freely now kept her from speaking up. Rumors began to circulate, not cruel at first, but casually dismissive. The kind of whispers that shape reputations more effectively than facts. Marcus doesn't collaborate well, someone said near the coffee machine. He's always in his own world. Another voice added, yeah, he's talented, but kinda cold, you know. Evelyn didn't contribute, but she didn't challenge them either. She stood there, staring at her cup of coffee, feeling the weight of complicity in her silence. Over time, small assumptions hardened into beliefs. When Marcus failed to greet her one morning, she decided he was deliberately ignoring her again. When he stayed late working alone, she interpreted it as avoidance. She never considered that he might simply be protecting his space, that years of quiet prejudice had taught him to stay guarded. There was one morning when Evelyn arrived early to prepare a campaign presentation. Marcus was already there, lost in his work, headphones on, completely unaware of her presence. She watched him sketch, each stroke purposeful, confident, patient. He seemed at peace when he was creating, the tension in his face softening. Yet the moment he realized she was near, his expression shifted back to distance. The walls reappeared. It was easier to see hostility than fear, easier to believe he disliked her than to confront her own discomfort. The contrast between how Marcus was perceived and what Evelyn occasionally glimpsed began to gnaw at her. During team discussions, she noticed how people interrupted him more often than anyone else. When he presented a design concept, someone would inevitably suggest a change before he could finish explaining his reasoning. No one interrupted others in that way. Still, Marcus never reacted. He simply nodded, took notes, and adjusted the designs, his restraint both dignified and heartbreaking. Evelyn's confusion deepened. She wanted to believe the workplace was fair, that everyone earned their place through skill and effort. But moments like these whispered otherwise. Her conscience flickered awake, telling her something was wrong, but habit and fear of being the overly sensitive new hire kept her quiet. One Friday afternoon, as the team gathered near the lounge, she overheard laughter again. Two colleagues were mimicking Marcus's soft tone, their mockery disguised as humor. Evelyn stood frozen. She wanted to walk away, but instead she stayed still, eyes fixed on the floor, guilt creeping up her spine. That moment would replay in her head later, her silence sounding louder than their laughter. Weeks passed, and the emotional gap between her and Marcus widened. She avoided him entirely now, convincing herself it was mutual. Their brief interactions were limited to email exchanges, formal, polite, and hollow. Yet deep down, an uneasy curiosity persisted. She couldn't stop thinking about the photo she'd glimpsed, or the faint tiredness in his eyes. Then came the company-wide announcement about the quarterly team lunch. Attendance was mandatory. As the seating chart circulated through the office email, Evelyn scrolled absent-mindedly until her eyes froze on one line. Table 3, Evelyn Carter and Marcus Reed. A nervous flutter stirred in her stomach. She told herself it was nothing, just coincidence. But her hands trembled slightly as she closed her laptop. The lunch was 3 days away, and she already dreaded the silence that would hang between them. She didn't know that the lunch would shatter every assumption she had built. The restaurant chosen for the company lunch was one of those modern, open spaces with exposed brick walls, soft jazz in the background, and a menu that tried too hard to sound casual. Evelyn arrived early, more out of anxiety than eagerness. The chatter of coworkers filled the air, laughter bouncing between tables as groups began to form naturally. The marketing team at one end, design at another, and management near the center. She noticed, with a mix of guilt and recognition, how easily the lines of separation appeared. Marcus sat at the edge of the room, his back to the window, posture neat, expression unreadable. When Evelyn took her assigned seat beside him, she felt the air tighten. She greeted him softly, hoping for even the smallest acknowledgement, but he only gave a polite nod. The faint reflection of sunlight on the glass caught the side of his face, revealing the fatigue in his eyes. She tried to make small talk about the latest campaign, but the words died between them. He responded briefly, respectful but distant. Around them, conversations bloomed, people laughing about vacations, swapping stories about clients. Yet at their table, silence ruled. Evelyn's irritation began to simmer. It wasn't just about the silence anymore. It was about feeling invisible. She had told herself she wouldn't care, but every second of his detachment felt heavier. She sipped her water, forcing herself to focus on the taste of lemon and ice rather than the emptiness between them. She wanted to believe he was just shy or disinterested, but deep down, resentment started to form again. Maybe he simply didn't like her. Maybe her instincts had been right all along. As the waiter served lunch, Evelyn watched Marcus unwrap a simple meal he had brought from home. Plain rice, vegetables, and something neatly packed in foil. While others indulged in plated entrees, his modest choice stood out. It seemed out of place in a restaurant setting, almost too humble for the environment. He didn't seem to notice or care about the curious glances from others. He quietly opened his bag, searching for a napkin. That was when Evelyn, in her nervous effort to move her drink aside, knocked her purse against the chair. It hit Marcus's bag, sending it tumbling to the floor. The sound drew a few glances from nearby tables. Evelyn bent quickly to help, her cheeks flushing. "I'm so sorry," she said automatically, reaching to steady the bag. But as she did, a small metal lunchbox slipped out, clattering softly on the tiled floor. The latch popped open, and from inside slid a folded piece of paper and a child's drawing. A burst of color caught her eye, crayon strokes of yellow and blue. The words uneven, but legible. "Daddy, you're my hero." She froze. Her breath caught as she looked up at Marcus. He didn't rush to grab it back. He simply stared at the lunchbox for a second before picking it up carefully, as though it were fragile. He placed the paper and drawing back inside without a word. His hands trembled slightly as he did so. Evelyn couldn't find her voice. The simple note, the drawing, the phrase, rattled her in ways she didn't expect. The truth settled over her like a quiet revelation. The fatigue in his eyes, the silence, the careful routines, it all made sense now. He wasn't arrogant or dismissive. He was a single father, balancing the weight of two worlds, keeping his private life hidden in a space where empathy often ran thin. Evelyn felt her irritation dissolve into something softer, something like shame. For the rest of the lunch, she sat in silence, her mind spinning. She began noticing things she hadn't before, the way he checked his phone discreetly, as if waiting for a message he couldn't afford to miss. How he didn't linger when others joked around, but instead slipped out quietly, unnoticed. She had spent weeks judging him, without knowing the first truth about his life. When the meal ended, Marcus excused himself to take a call, stepping outside to the sidewalk. Evelyn watched through the window as he held his phone close, his expression tightening. His voice was low, almost breaking. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she faintly heard through the glass. "I'll make it next time. I promise." Her chest tightened. The lunchbox now sat at his empty seat, and for the first time, she understood what it really carried. Love, exhaustion, and the quiet dignity of a man doing his best to hold his world together. The Monday after the team lunch, the office felt heavier than usual. The chatter and noise continued as always, but Evelyn moved through it differently now, aware, watchful. Something had shifted inside her, quietly but completely. She couldn't look at Marcus the same way anymore. Every time she caught sight of him sitting by the window, she saw the lunchbox, the drawing, the trembling voice on the phone. The man she had once dismissed as cold now seemed burdened with a kind of quiet strength she couldn't ignore. Marcus arrived earlier than anyone else, as he always did. Evelyn noticed that he was at his desk before the lights even flickered fully on, typing or sketching while the rest of the office was still finding its rhythm. He never complained, never called attention to his work, and never lingered around the social corners of the office where laughter was currency. When others went for long coffee breaks, he stayed. When deadlines loomed, he delivered without being asked twice. And yet, no one seemed to notice. His effort existed in the background, like the hum of an air conditioner, constant, necessary, but invisible. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn began to pay attention to details she had once overlooked. Marcus kept his phone within reach, but never used it unless he stepped outside. His lunch was always homemade, carefully portioned, the same compact box each day. Sometimes, he would rest his hand on the bag, as if assuring himself it was still there. He never joined office gossip, never laughed at the jokes that floated around. When others mocked a client or boasted about late-night projects, Marcus simply smiled politely and turned back to his work. There was a grace in his restraint, a discipline that Evelyn began to respect deeply. The office, however, didn't share her new awareness. The same old comments persisted, casual remarks about how Marcus didn't really fit the culture or how he was too reserved to lead. It was subtle, always dressed as concern or humor, but the effect was corrosive. Evelyn noticed how he heard those remarks without reacting, as though he had long since built an internal armor against them. He carried the weight of it with quiet dignity, never letting it show. One afternoon, she found herself standing near his desk, pretending to look at a design board while watching him review color palettes. His concentration was steady, his hands precise, his manner calm. She wanted to say something, to apologize for how she had misjudged him, for how everyone had. But the words never came. Fear held her back. Fear that he would misunderstand, that he would see her apology as pity, that it would only widen the distance between them. So she remained silent, just as she had before. And that silence felt heavier than any insult. Days blurred into weeks, and Evelyn's understanding of the office changed completely. She began to see the small politics that shaped everything, the way voices like Marcus's were often softened or erased in favor of those who looked or sounded a certain way. She saw her own complicity in the quiet approval of that system, her silence protecting her comfort at the expense of fairness. The realization was painful, but necessary. Yet, for all her awareness, Marcus remained unreachable. He maintained his distance, polite but careful, speaking only when required. Sometimes their eyes met across the room, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw something behind his composure, a trace of weariness, maybe gratitude. But it vanished too quickly to be sure. Then, late one Thursday afternoon, Evelyn overheard a fragment of conversation near the conference room. Two managers were discussing upcoming performance reviews. Marcus's name surfaced. The tone was cautious, but unmistakable. One of them mentioned redundancy. Another said low engagement. Her chest tightened as she pretended to focus on her computer screen. The rumors spread quietly over the next few hours. By the end of the day, it was clear Marcus Reed's position was at risk. For the first time, Evelyn felt the sharp edge of urgency. Watching him pack his things that evening, unaware of the whispers, she realized how deeply unfair the world beneath the surface could be, and how complicit she had been in not seeing it sooner. The tension in the office had grown thick, like air before a storm. Rumors of layoffs spread quickly, whispered between cubicles and coffee breaks. No one knew who would be next, but everyone had a theory. Evelyn tried to stay focused, yet every time she saw Marcus working quietly in his corner, she felt a tightening in her chest. His composure remained the same, steady and controlled. But beneath that calm surface, she sensed fatigue, a man bracing for a blow he'd already predicted. By midweek, Evelyn overheard the discussion that confirmed her fears. From behind the half-closed conference room door, she caught fragments of conversation between two senior managers. "Brilliant designer, sure," one voice said, "but no leadership potential. He keeps to himself too much." Another responded, "Team fit matters, not just talent. He's distant. Clients prefer someone more approachable." Their words were professional in tone, but carried the familiar undertone she had learned to recognize. Prejudice disguised as performance critique. Evelyn stood frozen, her pulse quickening. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but the injustice pulled her closer. Marcus's name became an anchor in her thoughts. How often he had been overlooked. How little anyone noticed the extra hours he worked, the quiet excellence he never boasted about. For the first time, anger replaced hesitation. The next morning, during the department meeting, the opportunity came. Kara, the supervisor, casually mentioned restructuring and the need for more dynamic contributors. When someone made a veiled comment about certain team members lacking communication skills, Evelyn's restraint snapped. She spoke without planning to. "I think that's unfair," she said firmly. The room turned toward her. "Marcus has contributed to every major campaign this quarter. He's just not the type to advertise his work. Half the design concepts on the Wallace account came from his revisions." Her voice shook slightly, but the conviction behind it held steady. For a moment, there was silence. Then a faint, dismissive smile from one of the executives. Kara folded her hands. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "we appreciate loyalty, but this isn't about effort. It's about impact and collaboration. Sometimes being part of a team means more than individual excellence." The words carried polite finality. Evelyn felt her cheeks warm. Her attempt to defend Marcus had already been reframed as sentimentality. When Marcus heard about the meeting later that afternoon, he didn't thank her. He didn't even look angry, just distant, detached in a way that hurt more than confrontation would have. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly as they crossed paths near the break room. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was cold enough to sting. "It makes things worse." Evelyn opened her mouth to explain, but no words felt right. She had wanted to help, to stand for fairness, but now it seemed she had done the opposite. The look in his eyes told her what he was thinking, that her defense was pity disguised as courage. The realization crushed her. He gathered his things, nodded politely, and walked away, leaving her with the sound of the vending machine humming behind her and a hollow ache in her chest. The next few days were unbearable. The office continued its rhythm, indifferent to the undercurrent of discomfort between them. Evelyn replayed every word she had said, every look she might have misread. For the first time, she questioned her own motives. Had she spoken up for him or for herself? Was her outrage truly empathy? Or was it a need to prove she was different from those who stayed silent? The questions spiraled, and with each one, her certainty faded. On Friday evening, Marcus left the office early. Evelyn thought nothing of it until Monday morning, when she walked in to find his desk cleared. The chair was pushed neatly under the table, the surface spotless, no trace of the man who had once sat there so quietly. His nameplate was gone. The space felt wrong without him, too empty, too final. No email, no explanation, no goodbye, just absence. The office felt different without Marcus. His absence was subtle but heavy, like the missing note in a familiar song. Days passed, and no one mentioned his name. His departure was absorbed into the usual corporate rhythm, new projects, new deadlines, polite smiles. Yet for Evelyn, the silence around his disappearance felt almost cruel. The empty desk across the room became a quiet monument to everything she hadn't said. She wanted to believe he had found a better job, that he had simply moved on, but something inside her doubted it. A week later, while helping Kara organize the supply room, Evelyn noticed a small key on a hook labeled "Storage Lockers." She hesitated before taking it. The corridor behind the design wing was nearly always empty. It smelled faintly of dust and cleaning spray. When she opened Marcus's locker, the faint metallic creak echoed through the stillness. Inside, neatly stacked sketchbooks lined one side, each labeled with dates and projects. On the top shelf sat his black backpack, the same one he carried every day. And beside it was the lunchbox. It looked ordinary, scuffed around the corners, the latch slightly bent from use. But as she lifted it, a faint chill ran through her. She placed it on the small table nearby and opened it carefully, as if it might break under the weight of her hands. Inside were folded napkins, a few colored pencils, and a sealed envelope with her name written in Marcus's neat handwriting. She stared at it for a long time before unfolding the letter inside. The handwriting was clean and deliberate, the kind of script that revealed patience and restraint. The first line stopped her breath. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I left quicker than planned. I didn't intend to disappear, but sometimes silence feels safer than explanations. I wanted to thank you for noticing things others didn't. Even when you didn't speak, I saw the questions in your eyes." He went on to describe how, after his wife passed away 3 years earlier, He had moved to Chicago with his daughter, Grace, trying to rebuild a life that constantly asked for more than he had to give. He wrote about the mornings that began before dawn, preparing Grace's lunch before heading to the office, and the evenings when he worked quietly so he could leave early to pick her up from school. "It wasn't the work that wore me down," the letter continued. "It was being invisible while doing it. Every idea I shared felt like it had to shout twice as loud to be heard. Every mistake I made seemed heavier. The silence in rooms wasn't neutral. It was full of judgment. People saw distance when I was only tired. They saw pride when I was only protecting what little peace I had left." Evelyn's eyes blurred, but she forced herself to keep reading. The drawing in the lunchbox was from Grace. "She made it the morning after my first rejection at work here. I told her it was fine, that kindness mattered more than recognition. She drew that picture and said, 'Then be kind to yourself too.' I've tried to remember that. Maybe one day people will understand that kindness is strength, not weakness." When she finished, Evelyn sat still, the letter trembling in her hands. The air around her felt too still, too honest. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not for Marcus, alone, but for her silence, her complicity, the moments when she could have spoken, but chose comfort instead. She realized that empathy wasn't enough if it stayed unspoken. She looked at the lunchbox again, at the faint scratch marks and chipped edges that hinted at years of use. Inside, the drawing was still there, Grace's handwriting, clumsy and bright. "Daddy, you're my hero." Evelyn smiled through her tears, recognizing now that heroism didn't always look grand. Sometimes it was quiet persistence, sometimes just showing up despite the weight of being unseen. By the time she folded the letter back into its envelope, the decision had already formed in her heart. She couldn't leave it like this, not with questions unanswered and gratitude unspoken. Marcus had disappeared into silence, but she wouldn't let that be the end. She would find him. She would return the lunchbox and tell him what she should have said long ago. It took Evelyn nearly 2 weeks to find him. The search wasn't simple. Marcus had left no forwarding address, no trace of his next step. She emailed a few mutual contacts from the office, only to receive polite shrugs or half-hearted guesses. Just when she was about to give up, she noticed a community event flyer posted on a coffee shop window near her apartment. It advertised a weekend art program for underprivileged kids, featuring local artists and volunteers. The name printed at the bottom, Marcus Reed, program coordinator, stopped her cold. That Saturday morning, she arrived at the community center tucked between old brick buildings on the west side of the city. The space was alive with the sound of laughter and the faint scent of acrylic paint. Inside, long tables were scattered with sketch pads, brushes, and jars of colored water. Children crowded around easels, painting with the kind of unfiltered joy only innocence allows. And there, near the back of the room, she saw him. Marcus stood beside a group of children, showing a little girl how to blend shades of blue into a softer tone. His posture was relaxed, his voice calm and encouraging. The girl giggled as she tried to mimic his brushstrokes. Evelyn recognized her immediately. Grace, the same child from the photograph in his bag. She looked healthier, happier, full of color and confidence. For a long moment, Evelyn stayed near the door, unseen, just watching. Marcus seemed lighter here, as though the weight he carried at the office had finally lifted. The corners of his mouth curved upward when Grace tugged at his sleeve. It was a different version of him, one unguarded, at peace. When he finally noticed her, his expression shifted, not with shock or resentment, but quiet curiosity. She walked closer, unsure what to say, the lunchbox clutched tightly in her hands. "I found this," she said softly, offering it to him. Marcus looked at it for a long time before taking it. "I didn't mean for anyone to find that," he said. His tone wasn't defensive. It was weary but not unkind. "I know," she replied, "but I'm glad I did." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the sound of laughter and paintbrushes tapping on jars. There was no apology in her words, no dramatic confrontation, only a shared understanding of everything left unsaid. She didn't try to explain herself, and he didn't ask her to. In that stillness, something between them eased. Evelyn stayed for the rest of the class, quietly observing how Marcus guided the children, never raising his voice, never showing impatience. He praised effort more than outcome, teaching them to value expression over perfection. Grace painted a tree with wide, reaching branches, and Marcus smiled as she proudly held it up for him to see. Evelyn felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, admiration mixed with humility. When the session ended, she lingered behind, helping clean the brushes and pack the paints. Marcus glanced at her a few times, but said nothing. She sensed his caution, and she respected it. Before leaving, she asked if the center needed more volunteers. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You'd want to do that?" he asked. She nodded. "I think I could learn something here." He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We meet every Saturday. Grace will be happy to have another helping hand." Over the next few weeks, Evelyn returned regularly. She arrived early, helped set up tables, and listened more than she spoke. She never tried to force conversation or seek forgiveness. Instead, she learned through the rhythm of their shared work, teaching kids to blend color, encouraging hesitant hands, watching the way patience could rebuild what silence had broken. Marcus began to speak more openly, not about the past, but about art, about the joy of watching children discover something beautiful within themselves. Slowly, he began to trust her presence. Their connection wasn't romantic or sentimental. It was something quieter and far more enduring. It grew from recognition, from the shared understanding of how fragile dignity can be and how empathy can restore it. One Saturday afternoon, as they posed for a group photo at the end of class, a local journalist who was covering the program snapped a picture of the volunteers and children. Evelyn stood beside Marcus, both smiling faintly, unaware of the significance of that moment. The following week, that same photo appeared on a community news site with the headline, "Art Program Unites Diverse Voices in Chicago's Heart." Evelyn didn't think much of it at first, but by Monday morning, the image had already started circulating online, her face beside Marcus's, the caption celebrating compassion and teamwork. She didn't know it yet, but that picture would change everything. The photos spread faster than either of them expected. Within days, the image of Marcus and Evelyn standing among the children had made its way across social media, first through local shares, then through professional networks. The caption beneath it read, "Art is empathy, when creativity bridges silence." It was simple, but the message resonated. Former co-workers from Lumen Advertising reposted it, adding comments about inspiration and progress. By the end of the week, Evelyn received an email from Kara, her old supervisor, asking to speak. The call came that afternoon. Kara's tone was unusually measured, her words chosen with care. "We're hosting a corporate diversity and inclusion event," she explained. "The board was impressed by Marcus's program and thought it would align perfectly with our new outreach efforts. We'd like to invite him and you to present together." Evelyn listened, aware of what was left unsaid. The company wanted redemption, too. She hesitated, then agreed, but only under one condition. Marcus would decide how the story was told. When she called him to explain, he was silent for a long time. "You really think they want to hear me?" he asked finally. "I think they need to," she replied. The day of the event arrived, on a bright Friday morning. The conference hall was transformed with banners and projection screens celebrating new visions, inclusive voices. The irony wasn't lost on Evelyn as she stood beside Marcus, watching executives in tailored suits sip coffee and exchange polite smiles. Marcus looked composed, though she sensed the nerves beneath his calm exterior. Grace, sitting quietly in the front row, waved at him with the same proud smile from the drawing Evelyn still remembered. When the time came to speak, Marcus didn't take the podium. Instead, he stood among his paintings displayed around the room, vibrant depictions of city life, portraits of ordinary people seen through the lens of resilience. He spoke softly, describing how the art program had begun, with nothing but a handful of brushes and a rented space. He told the audience about the children, how they painted not to impress, but to express, how art had given them a voice when the world overlooked them. Evelyn stood nearby, not as a presenter, but as support, letting his words carry the moment. There were no rehearsed statements, no corporate applause lines, just quiet truth. The audience listened, drawn in by his authenticity. For the first time, Evelyn saw the room that had once dismissed him, now fully attentive. When Marcus finished, the applause that followed wasn't the polite kind she had grown used to. It was genuine, unguarded. Kara approached him afterward with a tentative smile, offering him a consultancy position to lead creative outreach programs. Marcus thanked her, but didn't commit, only saying he would think about it. Later, as the event drew to a close, Evelyn and Marcus helped the volunteers pack up the artwork. The hall was almost empty now, the last traces of chatter fading into quiet. Marcus leaned against a table, looking tired but content. "You handled that well," she said. He smiled faintly. "I didn't handle anything. I just told the truth." Evelyn nodded. That was enough. There was no need for grand closure between them. What had changed wasn't their history, but their understanding of it. The silence that once separated them had transformed into something else. Respect, recognition, peace. Evelyn had learned that redemption didn't always arrive through apologies. Sometimes it came through presence, through the choice to stay and listen. As they gathered the last of the supplies, Evelyn noticed Marcus's familiar black bag resting by a chair. The old lunchbox peeked from inside, its latch still slightly bent. She smiled, unable to resist looking. When Marcus saw her glance, he nodded as if giving permission. Inside was a new drawing, Grace's latest creation. This one showed 3 figures, her father, Evelyn, and herself, standing beneath a painted sun, smiling. Evelyn's throat tightened as she closed the box gently. The story that had begun with misunderstanding and silence had found its ending in color and connection. For the first time, she understood that healing wasn't about rewriting the past, but about finally seeing it clearly and choosing to move forward. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who once changed the way you see others. Sometimes, a single moment of understanding can rewrite an entire life. And tell me, have you ever misjudged someone, only to later realize how wrong you were?